Joining us on Talking Sense today, Zakhele Mthembu. What's up, Zakes? How are you doing?
I'm good and good. How are you? Real.
I'm good, thanks. So, Zakes, I think a great place to start might be your background, because you're quite an unusual fellow, and I think it's worth just a little bit of how you ended up working for the Free Market Foundation. You know, what inspired you to do this, and tell us a bit about yourself.
Cool. Thank you. I like being an unusual fellow. You know? Everyone likes being unique and everything. But man, how did I get to be the rabid libertarian, as I would like to describe myself most of the time? I always had an interest, I would say, in political ideology. Right. I read a lot. I think the first ever political book I read was Steve Biko's I Write What I Like, and that coupled with Albert Lituli's biographies, just like for kids, right? And since then, I've just been, interested. So normally, as most, I think people who would be watching would know, right? If you're black in South Africa, as most cases than not, you would grow up with socialist influences or socialist adjacent influences, right?
Yeah.
And that really is, my trajectory. Get interested in political ideology, adopt socialism, read a whole lot of Marx. I have a friend who still makes fun of me of how I used to walk around the university with Marx's Capital, because I was interested in knowing. I like to call myself, I have an addictive personality, unfortunately. So I get addicted to a lot of things, including, the accumulation of knowledge. So I was addicted to that. But, now I see there was something off, right, with Marxism. I was like, man, why can't these Marxist guys get rich, these capitalist guys, right? What's wrong? And then I try figuring out the economics of it. I see all the arguments against Marxism. And I started down the rabbit hole. I start reading the calculation problem by Mises. I'm like, man, who is this guy? Who? To this day, I'm still yet to find a better argument against, Marxism. Against any planned economy, right? Just the appreciation of economic science. And I realized then that I did not know anything really about economics, and it just started the spiral. And I was fortunate enough because I was looking for capitalist organizations or capitalists in South Africa, right? And then there was this Austrian W.H. Hart, who was a professor in Cape Town, has a very great book on wages in South Africa too during the apartheid era. And he was, of course, speaking against, state planning. And then I stumbled upon the writing of Gabriel online as I was searching for, South African capitalists, people who were arguing for these ideas within the South African context. And really the rest is history. Mbeake used to be an employee of the Free Market Foundation, and really his writing was the primary impetus for me to be interested, not only in libertarianism as an ideology. I already had, burgeoning interest, you could say, through economics, but the political and ethical side of it I never really pursued until I saw other people like Mbeake pursuing it, and then started knowing about the FMF, and the rest is history.
Okay, so given that background, what did you end up kind of studying at university that informed your kind of your thinking? And what do you do for the Free Market Foundation, given your kind of this libertarianism?
I think I was perfect, right, for libertarianism. I always tell people that libertarianism is a legal philosophy. It's a philosophy of law, and I studied law in university, so I think it complemented each other well, because I could see it. The first few years of my law degree were not, particularly the best, because I had the problem of connecting my natural legal impulses in terms of philosophy with the positivist outlook my adopted political ideology at that time propounded, right? Marxism, there's no inherent natural law. There's only what, the worker state decides is law. And you see it too in practicality with all these show trials that a lot of communist regimes have. So this was, a conflict. So libertarianism helped me a great deal, right? In actually seeing okay, cool, I can argue for political ideology, not only one that works, right? Because the reason I was interested in politics is because, just like everyone in South Africa, really, at least if you grew up in a place that I do, you want to change things. And unfortunately, right, you see this when you become a libertarian, that a lot of people think that the political avenue is the best way to change, people's lives. Unfortunately, in Africa as a whole, but in South Africa especially, because the examples of success that you have of people who look like you are people in the political sphere. So you want to be involved in the political sphere in some manner in order to effect change. But what libertarianism, teaches you when you understand economics is that the people who actually do truly affect change are like ordinary people, ordinary entrepreneurs. So I studied law. That influenced my libertarian outlook, and I think it complements it quite well because libertarianism is a legal philosophy. And for the FMF, really, started as a legal researcher, but really I'm a policy officer. Everything concerning libertarian policy. I have a special interest, of course, in anything relating to the law and economics, which would include, competition law. I probably, if you know of me, you probably have read something of mine on competition law and me railing against the Competition Commission.
Yes.
So I pretty much write articles and write policy briefs, conduct research, just like the JSEC paper that I did.
Yeah.
And pretty much try and influence the South Africa policy's direction to move more towards capitalism and liberty.
And so one of the things that you mentioned earlier was that you said that in South Africa there's a kind of cliche that black people are kind of brought up in with more socialist surrounding by more socialist ideas, and like white people are surrounded by like more kind of capitalist ideas. We here at the Common Sense think that this kind of cliche is complete nonsense. That people are their own individuals and capable of making their own decisions, and the color of your skin has nothing to do with the ideas that you will subsequently hold.
That's true.
But why do you think why do you think this cliche has developed? And then also kind of follow on to that, as a black South African libertarian, what is it about that ideology that you think is useful in the South African case, right?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, to start with, the cliche, right? You can understand maybe where it stems from, misguided as it is, because I agree that it's misguided, right? Everyone is an individual, and we should an appreciation of that. Just shows how beautiful the world can be. But historically, you could say that there was a racial distinction, but there wasn't. There were white communists during the apartheid era too, as much as there were black liberals. There's a guy called Phumlani Majozi who has an amazing book, Phumlani Majozi, and his book is about the history of black South African liberals, right, dating back to the apartheid era. And I'm like, there is a history, there is evidence to show that it isn't as clear-cut like that. And of course, I'm biased, right? I will always favor the side that says that, let us give people individual autonomy, give them individual agency. And if they decide to congregate on the premise of that voluntariness of their agents, okay, we'll create our own communities and we'll have certain things that we want to do on the basis of voluntariness, I see no problem with that, right? But the idea that, just by the virtue of the color of your skin, you are socialist, you are capitalist, I find it is just absurd, right? Because reality does not bear it true. So I really do not support the thinking of that. But particularly why I think, libertarianism is going to be useful for, the South African context is, a lot of people, I was interested in solving the problem, right? If you were to look at just the statistics that a lot of people on the left would cite about the income disparities, not only within, across racial groups, but within racial groups themselves, particularly the black, demographic, there's intraracial inequality that's quite higher than interracial inequality, right? So all of these problems, the poverty rate, unemployment rate, the general, I always make this example that international publications, when they think of poverty, they think of someone in Africa not having something, right? Even the saying that some kids in Africa are starving, I'm like, I don't like that. I don't want that to be borne out by reality. I don't want for someone to be like, man, people in Africa are starving. Then when they go to Africa, they find people starving, right? That hurts me in a great deal. And if you look at the evidence, right, which is something as a researcher I have to look at, if you look at the evidence of what policies work to generate wealth across human history, you see that there are policies of liberty, there are policies of economic freedom, allowing people to be entrepreneurial, to enterprise, and to trade voluntarily, not only with each other in whatever jurisdiction domestically, right, but internationally too, right, which is unfortunate that currently, the international order is moving towards more protectionism, which I think will make us poorer in the long run. But I think South Africa and Africa as a whole, more than any place, right, if we are poor statistically, a large percentage of our population still live below the poverty line, and there is no magic wand that can be waved that can, magically give people wealth. There has to be certain policies that will be put in place, not because of some, magical plan that someone has, but to allow people themselves to take themselves out of poverty. And there's no better system than the system of free markets and free enterprise.
Well, I'll give you some pushback on that,
Cool.
because there are a lot of different kind of models that have been adopted, especially in recent history, that points to different kind of modes of development. One might argue that while China was adopting a kind of free market model, it was a free market with central kind of planning, and so maybe I'm asking you here, what is the negative case? So you've laid out the positive case that it seems as though the model of free market capitalism is the greatest creator of value and wealth in society and human history, which is not something I necessarily disagree with. But what is wrong with state-led development models?
I think China. I like China a lot because it provides the perfect case study of why our ideas, at least the ideas I advocate for, work. Right. If you look at China, let us take like one extreme. The extreme is free market capitalism, totally without any state control or direction, and the other one is totally planned economy, communism. Something that's been, I wouldn't say has been tried to its fullest extent, as some socialists would say, in as much as would say that in a completely unfettered free market. So we have these degrees and we have the spectrum. And the closer we got China under Mao, one could say that was closer to the planned spectrum than it is to the free market spectrum. So if we're gonna say that the planned, model works, beyond, I'm not even a consequentialist, right? There's the ethical case of saying that you cannot allow someone with agency to not trade with someone if they aren't hurting them, right? There's no basis. It is unjust. It is an injustice at a legal and ethical level. But the consequences, since people are convinced by empirical arguments, right? You look at the empiricism. China only started becoming wealthy when China moved from the super planned end of the spectrum to closer to the free market end of the spectrum. That only shows that when China was, if we were to follow the logic of full state planned, we have the famine that was in China. We have the millions of people dying. We have the carnage that necessitated men like Deng Xiaoping and the entire reformists to actually exist and want to institute reform. So I'm saying the model has been tried, right? There's of course other indexes that actually do show the higher degree of freedom a certain jurisdiction has, like the Economic Freedom of the World Index, right? It shows us that the more freedom a certain jurisdiction has, the more wealthier it tends to be. So I guess from that correlation, we can draw an inference. We would see free markets produce more wealth, whilst planned economies produce less wealth. I like to say that in China, the Chinese would be much more wealthier if they were not trying to still direct their economy as much as they are, right? If they were to just allow the Chinese people to generate and create value. But, they are actually held back by their state plan, because we know that when they had more of it, they were less wealthy. The moment they had less of it, they became more wealthy. And I think that makes the best case.
And so, but what is it about the state planning and the state-led development that leads to it producing less wealth than the free market?
Yeah, it's because it comes from a fundamental understanding. I think this is where the ethical case, right? Ethically, as I said, you cannot tell someone what to do because they are a human being, right? Just like you. What right do you have? But when it comes to economics, it is concerned with the creation of value, right? So if you are gonna be concerning yourself with the creation of value, you have to understand where the value itself comes from. But economic science long discovered this a long time ago, that value is subjective. That is why I can look at a piece of art and say, I am not paying anything for it, and someone else can pay millions for it. And it does not detract away from the value of the art piece just because I'm not willing to pay $1 million for it. And this is at the core, really, the problem with planned economies is that they cannot account for the subjective valuations of everyone in society, because it's just impossible to, as a single person. You are only just going to be expressing your own valuations and what you think ought to be the valuations of others. But what usually happens is that when your valuations as the central planner meet the valuations of other people, becomes a clash, a contradiction. You run into problems like, problems that they had in communist Russia, having too many shoes and not too many jeans, or things like that, because there is no system to communicate the preferences, right? Because so you have people who have preferences, and then you have people trading with one another, developing the price system. The price system is pretty much what sends information to everyone in society that this is what we want for this much, and this is what producers should produce. But when you eliminate that, which is only possible really with free trade and free markets, right, with commercial culture, when you eliminate, private property and the ability of people to trade, then you make it impossible to to get this information of what people actually value and what they find important, and it just makes your attempt at creating value futile. Right? Yeah.
For sure. But, given the history of apartheid, specifically in this country, I think the kind of left-wing, center-left argument is always that there has to be space for the state to help with the development of the country, because the kind of, you keep going to ethics and morality, they will make the moral case that because of the kind of disadvantages that black people faced during the apartheid era, they need a kind of leg up in order to facilitate their development because they're a step behind, and it's kind of, trying to even the scales. And that there's, we've heard, I'm sure you've been subjected to this moral argument tons of times, as have I. And so, is there not space for the state in South Africa's case?
Man, you see, I'm ideological, I'm quite ideological. As I said, I like to think of, if we say the state is good, then I always say, which logical extreme would you prefer, right? The logical extreme of state planning, the logical extreme of free markets. And a lot of people would cop out and say they would prefer neither. And I was like, gun to your head, really, you had to choose, right? Yeah. I think most people, through their actions, really, would definitely choose the one where there's liberty of action. So really, I'm quite ideological, right? I don't want the idea, right? Firstly, on like thinking about it, so that black people would need a leg up from the state, right? And then you look, okay, cool, what does the state get its resources from, right? The state gets its resources from taxing its population. By default, if black people are the biggest demographic in the country, they will comprise a large percentage of the tax base by default, because they are, and then there's progressive income taxation, which maybe may skew the entire figures, but there will be black people paying taxes to a state so that it helps them with their own tax monies to get a leg up. To me, it doesn't make sense. I'm saying eliminate the middleman. If there is a base to be taxed and revenue to be raised by the state so that it can distribute it to other people, let us make it so that we grow this revenue base. Let us make it so that we have as many people not reliant on the state as we possibly can, so that the state could, even if you want the state to have a lot of revenue, it raises more revenue when less people are reliant on it, right? So I'm like, I think the solution really to a people who are like, apartheid did it, I'm like, that you have to realize, right, with me coming from it from a natural law perspective, is that the elimination of injustice is enough for justice, right? Like justice is not having injustice, particularly in the political sense like this, because I'm like, the fact that, the black population of South Africa is no longer barred from participating in any area of people activity ought to be enough. That ought to be it, and everything else premised off of that should be like on the backs of the black population of South Africa, building it themselves, right? Not contingent on the state acting as a middleman, because irrespective, like the idea that you can have certain taxpayers, like I can only imagine you are a taxpayer too, Gabriel, you're white, and saying that your taxes should not work for you, I don't think that would be ethical, because you pay taxes too, right? Why should the state favor one particular group over another? Like we are, while still collecting and extracting taxes from that, understanding that in the past when the state was doing that, it was considered unjust, right? So I'm like, why want to perpetuate that, particularly in this case, right? The group you want to perpetuate it against is a minority. I'm like, Let
Yeah.
us logically think about it at the end, right? How will it work? How will it end out, right? Let us say you have taxed everyone to death. You will still be left with a large black population that will pretty much be funding their own leg up. And I find that to be truly absurd. As I said, there's no way to redistribute your way to wealth. There's just no way.
And it also, what you're talking about as you were kind of talking there, it made me think about the fact that, one of the kind of big policy issues that the government seeks to drive a wedge between the different demographic groups in South Africa over is this question of land reform and the changeover of land. And you love to use the statistics around private ownership of land as a means of saying, look, there's been essentially no progress in the kind of racial division of land in the country, despite the fact that what they're doing is playing a secret trick, because there has actually been quite a lot of expropriation of land happening. A few million square meters have actually been expropriated by the government since democracy, and they have put black farmers on that land. The thing that is the trick that's been pulled is those black farmers are never given access to title to that land. And so essentially, what as you were talking, it kind of came to me as part of this as well, is that if you rely on the state to drive development, it will see itself as the primary means in which development has. So it will think to itself, maybe on something like this land question, well, the land should just be in our hands.
Precisely, because you don't know what to do with it. You aren't smart enough. You shouldn't own it. You will sell it, as the retort will be, right? If they say if restitution happens and people are given their land back, they sell it back to developers or whomever. I'm like, then what's the problem? It's their land, right?
Yeah.
So like, as I said, the ethics of it are very important to me, because it comes like state planning comes from a place of thinking that you know how to run other people's lives. There's a very dangerous form of thinking when implemented, as you say, right? All these black farmers, I'm a proponent of restitution. Restitution is giving back land to the people who are entitled to it or would have been entitled to it had no injury happened, right? So I'm like, rather than the state owning it, give people ownership. This is what creates, like, let them actually be property owners. You are perpetuating this imbalance in terms of power relations because white farmers own their land. And when you say you are doing land restitution for black farmers, you don't allow them to own their land. And you're saying it's for their own good. I'm like, how is that for their own good? But that is the nature of the state, right? Someone who is in the state, who is in control of all of these parcels of land, it means they are effectively the owner of them. That's why you have politicians also having farms and all of these things. You see it in most jurisdictions, right? So that's what happens too, even though one would say, they also do give the leases to the farmers. I'm like, they should give them ownership. That's the only way that will be effect and actually change the ownership patterns, right? But the fact that they aren't willing to do that, to me, is unfortunate, because it perpetuates this insistence, this reliance on the state, which I think erodes a whole lot of agency and personal responsibility, particularly in the population group that it is directed at, right? Black people are told a lot in South Africa that their salvation is in the States, and I think this cripples their ability to think of solutions outside of the States, as I said earlier on.
Yeah, and that's actually, that idea that you're talking about there was something that I had a kind of brief conversation a few months back with Muzi Kuzwayo, who's now the head of South Africa's Promise, but he was the CEO of one of South Africa's big ad agencies, TNWA, I think Hunt Lascaris is the name. But he put forward this idea in our conversation that the idea of, previously disadvantaged individuals, this kind of phrase that we use, is actually quite offensive to him, because it not only is it, as you say, kind of telling, kind of a subtle kind of hint that black people need some sort of, kind of advantage to be able to compete, the subtle implication of that there's somehow inferiority. But then the other thing that he says is that what you do, if you call me a previously disadvantaged individual, like in talking in his case, if you call his mother that raised him, who spent every day working as hard as possible to be able to send him to school and then to be able to afford to send him to university, you're minimizing her work to try and then you're minimizing the rest of his family's work, because it is this view of humanity that, as you say, removes any sort of individual agency, not only from the person themselves, but from the community that produces, because no person is an island. And yeah, so what do you kind of make of that idea?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, right? I have to agree with Muzi Kuzwa there because man, it is quite insightful, and like I always talk about the dangers of state reliance, and you see it in South Africa, right? I grew up in the township, and township during the apartheid era is different from the township in the modern day, because the township in the apartheid era could not rely, in most cases, they're not, on the apartheid state coming to help it. So the communities were organized within themselves. There was a lot of civic action within South African townships. And in the modern day, nothing happens unless a councillor comes, unless someone goes and protests to the state. And this has, I always thinking of something as simple, right? Rural schools in South Africa, all throughout South Africa, struggle with pit toilets, right? There are certain schools that used to have pit toilets. I don't think there's still some that do, but I may be mistaken. But, for the mere fact that a school that is surrounded by a community that lives there, that takes their children there, could not build a functional toilet for their school, right? All the parents, everyone there. Instead, they waited for the state. Admittedly, the state should do that. If it is a publicly funded school, that's what, resources should be spent adequately, right? I'm saying that the harm in that is that the insistence that black people cannot do anything without the influence of the states, the involvement of the state, eliminates even the necessity for them to solve simple problems, at least according to me, like building a toilet for their own children in a school, right? Simple problems like ensuring that the school in their community is protected and not, subject to thieves who will come and rob a computer lab that took years to build. Yeah. All of these are things that have to and will only happen if there is an impetus among people themselves that they see themselves as responsible for their fate. If the government tells them that you aren't responsible for your unemployment, you aren't responsible for your lots in life, which again you can understand where that argument comes from. I always like to give people a bit of grace, because I doubt that most people are as malicious as would like to make them seem. Right? Yeah, but you can understand where they are coming from, but you have to also see the harm in thinking like that. Like it is extremely harmful when you tell someone that they aren't responsible for their life, and rather someone else, some state policy is, and their only response to it is another state policy that will favor them. I'm like, then what are they to do, right? What they are thinking then is stunted in the sense that they don't think that they can effect change, because they think that their position in life is not of their own doing, which just cripples. If you want to see, any population group prosperous, you have to at the very least, right, make them believe that they have the power to change their position. That's the only way they'll be able to do it. And if you say the state is the only one that's able to do it, I think you're undermining the very end that you may be seeking to. So yeah, I have to agree with the guy. He hit the nail right on the head.
Yeah, and I think it's quite the opposite message to tell people that, your prosperity is in your hands. The responsibility of your life success is in your hands. The only person who can make you a successful person is you. That's actually a pretty optimistic thing to tell people, because you can tell them that you don't actually have to. Don't worry about what anyone else does. You can remove all of that from the rest of your head and only worry about what you do and making sure that it's such a shame that that is not a mainstream narrative just generally in South Africa. I don't think that the kind of liberal side of the political aisle and the DA, they don't go and do a good job of getting this message across of, your life success is in your hands, no one else's. And there's no one who's, a kind of political class is so used to this idea that, you need to kind of tell people, sorry, you're a victim, I'm sorry, so sorry about that, that's really tough. Instead of treating people as, agents with individuals with their own agency.
And responsibility too, right? Because that's the other side. That's what is needed, right? If you're responsible for your success, you're also responsible for your failures. And I think that is the scary part, maybe for most people, that like it is the whole being responsible for your position in life, for your own failure. If your position, at least you don't think is that great, then it's like, I'm not. But I think I agree with you, right? Our political class is also not in favor of at least this brand of liberty that's like, no, as much as we possibly can, we need to give the power to the individual. And that also means not being reliant on the state as much as you were. But yeah, no, the state, I call it paternalism, really is normalized in the South African context, right? From our history, even in our political aisle, no one really, argues for the extreme end of the spectrum, which I think is what we need to solve our crisis. So yeah, but I agree with you though, positivity.
And I think also as well, but just, so that it doesn't come off as I'm just bashing the ANC and whatever, because I think that the apartheid state was as guilty of this kind of, and for want of a better, this mind-numbing message, because the apartheid state was telling the Afrikaners, we're going to look after you, and now the ANC is telling the African black people, we're going to look after you.
Precisely.
And so in the fact of the matter is that South Africa, pre and post apartheid, has this narrative of, state reliance has always been there. And it's been, the crazy few like you who have been around trying to get people to go and take their own responsibility, tie your shoelaces.
No, Ramaphosa should do it for me.
Yeah, exactly.
Please, man, it sucks. And you see it like with the Afrikaans community, right? The moment the state was no longer as, paternalistic towards them, see the institutions they've built independently, right? Through like voluntary organizations of Afrikaners who wanted to build their own institutions. And that is something that is beautiful. And I think that, there's something about knowing that, big daddy government is coming to save you that just kills the spirit of doing that. And I find that unfortunate, as I said, because I come from a part of a population group, of a family, of a community that desperately needs that. That desperately needs people to like take responsibility and agency and actually change their position, because there's no other way. To me, it is like, beyond the ideology. Like if we want things to get better, there's no other way. We can we've tried this whole state planning thing and it is not working out because it will not work out. So, let's try something different. Let's just maybe try personal responsibility and, telling people you are responsible for yourself, the good and the bad too. And I think that is a very powerful message to send, particularly to people who, you may think have been hard done in the past. Nothing, at least to me, is as empowering as saying, you can change your situation. Even if someone harmed you, it's okay. They don't have power over you. You have power over your own conditions. And I think that's a very powerful message, not only for South Africa, but for the African continent in its entirety. And it also solve a whole lot of problems, right? If we can change our position, maybe we stop taking money from international aid institutions as much and all of those things.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more that, a healthy dose of, personal responsibility is nothing but a good thing. But I want to move our conversation away from the kind of this great general kind of overview of South Africa, role of, more libertarian ideas, and focus on some policy work that you've done very recently. And this is on the Job Seekers Exemption Certificate, which is a policy proposal by the Free Market Foundation. So what is it, and what are you hoping to achieve with this kind of proposal?
Yeah, so the Job Seekers Exemption Certificate is a policy proposal developed by our president, the great Eustace Davey, a couple of years ago, in response really to the South African unemployment crisis. I'm sure we can all agree it's a crisis. So really what it is it's a certificate that will allow someone, you can sign up for it at any municipality, of course, if it is adopted, but it will allow you to be exempt from all labor regulations. And then you are able to contract with any potential employer on your own terms, totally exempt from labor regulations, and most importantly, protecting your potential employer from being prosecuted using those exempted laws. So this is something that if you're unemployed, you would voluntarily agree to walk into your municipal offices, say I've been unemployed for 6 months, get the certificate and say that I want to be exempt from labor laws. get the certificate that says you will be, and then from there you go to a potential employer and you will, sign a contract that will be exempt from those laws. That's pretty much it. We hope that with, if it is adopted, probably passed as an act of parliament. I'm sure it can be made work without it being an act of parliament, but ideally it will have to be an act of parliament that will allow for these exemptions to exist at the municipal level. And we hope that it will solve the unemployment crisis. Every study that you will look at really about the South African labor market tells us that it is overly regulated. It is, it discourages firing. It discourages hiring due to complicated hiring and firing procedures, right, that are pretty burdensome and, right, they incur a whole lot of costs for potential employers. And just our regulatory regime is not the best for absorbing particularly our low-skill, youthful, our low-skill and youthful unemployed population who cannot really compete for the type of high-skill positions that are largely available in the South African labor market. And the reason that low-skill positions would not be viable in the South African labor market is because, our labor regulations do not make them possible. Regulations, all labor laws, the LRA, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, the National Minimum Wage Act, the JSEC would exempt you of these. And then once you're exempted, we believe, and if we were to look at evidence in other jurisdictions that have deregulated their labor markets, believe it will encourage growth in employment rates and decrease unemployment.
So I'm with you in terms of the intention. I think that it's a great thing, and that I agree with you that we are facing an unemployment crisis, and that solving that problem should be number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 of the government's top priorities. But in kind of practical terms, a question that comes to mind is, what is the current kind of minimum wage structure, and how much lower could someone go? Like, how is this actually going to help someone find a job that they might otherwise not be able to find? And then also, because it's not just obviously employing people is great, but the other intention of something like a minimum wage is so that people can have enough money to live on. And so how do you prevent some kind of exploitation of people who are desperate people, and prevent them from being paid not enough money to live on, essentially?
Yeah, I think we have to look at the context, right? If someone is willing to voluntarily take a wage that will be considered exploitative, what is the alternative for that person? The alternative is them getting no wage. That is currently the reality for millions of South Africans. And this is something that gets a lot of people upset. And I don't get, because we are essentially, if we don't allow someone, if we don't make it legal for someone, voluntarily, I might add, and exploitation and non-exploitativeness is entirely subjective, right? You can look at my payslip and think, I would be exploited if I was paid that much. And I can look at yours and saying they are exploiting him, but you would not think the same when we're looking at them ourselves, right? So it is a subjective valuation. The minimum wage, the same problems with central planning. It tries to put an objective value of what the floor should be for everyone, and not everyone's floor is the same. And I think when you try and institute something that is uniform for different people, you run into these problems like having structural unemployment as we have in South Africa, because there is just no way that all of these people will be able to align with your valuation of what a fair wage is. And I think a great example for this would be, the immigration issue, if we like, that South Africans have, right? A normal South African who's against illegal immigration would be like, an illegal immigrant is taking, my job. And I'm like, but that should tell you something, right? The employer is probably willing to hire an illegal immigrant at a much more lower wage, at a market wage, right? Because irrespective of what we want, we can make the minimum wage 5,000. Why not make it? Because there are market forces that we have to account for. And if you have a skill that fetches a particular wage in the market and you're still able to get employment, the government saying that your skill should fetch a particular wage that is higher than what the market has decided will not make you magically earn that wage. Instead, what will happen is that your job will just disappear. It will not be worthwhile for businesses to hire you. It is not worthwhile for a lot of businesses that would say should be absorbing a lot of these low-skilled workers in South Africa, restaurants and things like that, to hire South Africans, because at the cost for them would just not be worth it for South Africans. I'm saying, then why don't you allow South Africans who choose, who want to work there, who are saying, I will take that wage? It is wholly voluntary, right? Which is why I like that aspect of it. If you think that a particular wage is exploitative, don't take the job. You know, you can just not take the job. But what should not happen is you should not bar someone from taking that job just because you think that they are being exploited, right? For the mere fact that they are taking an action that is a choice between not taking the job and taking the job, and their choice is taking the job, it definitely means that the action they did not take is worse, at least for them, right? So how? Like, who is someone else to come in and say, no, you were being exploited because I feel bad? I'm like, no, let us just give people the agency, the responsibility to be able to be responsible for themselves, and let the market deal with the distribution of wages and the distribution of resources concerning which wages, which skills fit to which sort of wages in the market. When you have the government do that, it distorts everything, creates the kind of problems that we have, like the structural unemployment that there seemingly is no way to solve outside of actually deregulating our labor markets. That is the only way. That is the way that should happen.
And so another kind of question that comes to my head as you talk there is, like, I agree with you that we are objectively it's a very onerous country to try and do business in, and particularly on the hiring front, it is a nightmare. We're at the Common Sense. One of the things that you often have to think about as a startup is any person you bring on is essentially a life commitment, because if they aren't going to be a good employee and are going to be an actively bad employee, then they will bring the end of life to the business with them. And because you're almost unable to fire someone unless they do something insanely egregious. And then on the other hand, the question also becomes, it doesn't seem as if it's just that it's difficult to fire people and onerous to hire them. These labor regulations are really bad, but one of the things that has certainly been driving our unemployment up is the fact that our economy has been growing at a rate that's slower than our population has been growing at, right? So we have the same amount of value every year being split between more and more people. And so it's also important. One of the things that will bring the unemployment levels down certainly is growth. And so is it not maybe the lack of growth that's the major driver of unemployment rather than the regulations of the labor?
I'm like, then we have to interrogate why aren't we having a lot of growth? What spurs growth? Creation of new enterprises, the employment of people creating value, then using that value in other areas of the economy, and that leads to people wanting to pretty much take care of each other's needs. The creation of value, really, deregulation cuts at the core of it, right? Because the reason the South African economy, I mentioned the Economic Freedom of the World Index, right? And we keep on sliding down, meaning our country's becoming less and less free, at least for doing business. And we see the results in this in like our actual outcomes, right? In like life expectancy, income levels, tax base, capital formation, all of these things are like on a downward trend, whilst unemployment and population are the only things that are growing. And I think what is responsible for growth is people have to create businesses, employ other people, and pretty much generate value, serve one another in the economy, and serve others in the global economy. And that you should want to make that as easy as possible. That is what will drive growth. The reason we don't have growth is because doing those things that create like growth is hard. It is strenuous. It is very difficult. And that's one of those things includes hiring people, right? When you create a business, you have to have employee. You are an employee yourself, right? But if you want to, depending on what type of business you have, you will have employees. And if all of these things that lead to the creation of value, which then leads to growth, are very difficult to do, then you are just, pretty much going nowhere. That is why I think, even though the problem is not solely limited to labor regulations, there are regulations even in like the actual, registration of businesses themselves. They are the things they have to comply with depending on what type of business on what type of business you're running, right? So there's that element too, but I think it cuts to the core of saying state interference. Once you make it easier for people to do the things that create growth, which is start businesses and employing other people, then it all trickles down. We have growth, gets rid of unemployment and everything else.
And so then the last kind of question I have on that point is, if you are right, about the kind of effect of what the effect of allowing people to voluntarily exempt themselves from labor regulations would be, surely, and that implies that it's the regulations themselves that are the problem. So why not just keep going? Why stop with poor unemployed people who want to take low skilled jobs? Why is it just a job seekers exemption certificate? Why was the policy paper not, here is every labor regulation that needs to be destroyed in order to have growth in the South African economy?
Yeah, I think for the reasons we spoke about earlier, really concerning the climate, the context of South Africa, right? The political climate. Because when I was writing the paper, the report, I wanted to make it practical. What is a practical solution I can introduce that can have some, viability of success? Of course, ideally, right? Ideally, I want to get rid. I'm an anarcho-capitalist, so I'm even to the further right of most people who are libertarians. So I don't want any regulations. I am a huge fan of Bruno Leone. I hate the very idea of legislation. This very idea, right? Irrespective of what that legislation is. So I'm like, hey, if we're arguing for get scrapping, I'm there with you.
Yeah.
I also want to effect real change and to present a pathway to someone who may not be an anarcho-capitalist, who will be like, okay, maybe I don't feel comfortable getting rid of all of them. I'll be like, okay, cool. Let those who choose to be exempt from them be exempt for, a particular period of time, because the certificate is only, valid for 24 months. And then after that, the assumption is that you go back to the normal regulatory regime now with skills you have accumulated in the job market, and you can renegotiate your contract with your employer under new terms subject to, existing legislation. I think this I try to make it easily adoptable, right? I try to make someone who may even see it and be like, someone will be exploited by this, to not walk away feeling like I am arguing for the destruction of their world, which, by the way, I can argue for. But, I wanted it to be practical, right? I feel like it's a nice middle of the road position to take for both parties, people on my side who want the labor market to be as deregulated as possible, and people on the other side who want labor protections according to them, right? And I think that if we just harp on the fact that people will be the one choosing, it is much more easier for both sides to be accepting, right? Someone may choose to not be, and someone may choose to be subject to it. The fact that it has a time limit, I think, will make it much more palatable, really. It was like for practical purposes, but yeah, the problems, right? Principally, the problems are the regulations. Ideally, to maximize the benefits that we could get from a policy like JSEC, it would have to get rid of the regulations across the board and not have a time limit on them. But I can dream.
Yes, well, I mean, I think, because the point I'm making here and why I asked you this question is, I think that actually on a kind of practical political level, if you had taken the step further and gone, instead of the job seekers exemption certificate, you going straight after this kind of deregulation, here are but maybe narrowed your focus, picked out the three worst aspects and gone, let's just terminate these, torpedo straight into them. I think that might actually prove to be an easier sell for you than this specific kind of piece of legislation, because I understand the kind of reasoning behind you wanting to make it so that politicians can argue that what I'm trying to do is help unemployed people find a job, right? But what you're also then doing is you're getting them to have to argue the poorest of the poor, most vulnerable, because that's kind of what the unemployed are. True. I'm arguing in favor of, allowing those guys to essentially remove their rights. And so you kind of, an argument of making the vulnerable even more vulnerable.
And according to them. And this is why I said, like, the important thing is, if you're going to say that I have rights and I have protections, and then I willingly say, I don't want them, am I, whose view should prevail, I think. And this cuts at the core of like really why I'm a libertarian, right? Because I don't think that we can realistically say, even though of course politically a politician will be like, oh no, maybe they think they'd get hammered because making the vulnerable more vulnerable. But I'm like, this is a choice on their part, right? They are clearly not as vulnerable as you make them out to be because they are choosing to be subject to these conditions. But most importantly, South Africa recognizes the right to choice, right? The dignity is a part of choice. Like choice is a part of dignity, that is, meaning that every human being has to have agency. This is something really beyond ideological. It is reality. Everyone has agency. They all choose what to do. And I'm saying, why not extend that to the most vulnerable? Why should I think the most vulnerable are the ones who need to make their own choices the most. But that is an issue of perception. I do get you though. That like it may be harder for a politician to sell it. I'm like, then the politician has to do a good job of showing why it is the best position.
No, I am with you in that. I agree that I'm with you in the thinking behind the certificate. I'm with you in that it is important that people, and if this is going to increase levels of employment, then it's just necessarily a good thing. But what I'm trying to tell you is that maybe you missed an opportunity to go after after the actual regulations, because it might be I understand how you kind of get to this, because you want politicians to be able to argue in favor of helping the most vulnerable, but you also by kind of making the focus onto that group, you then open the opportunity to use that group as a kind of, as opposed to if you were arguing that we're taking some labor rights away from Karen van die Plaas in sitting in a lovely office in Sandton, then it's actually then all of a sudden you're like, actually, well, maybe Karen doesn't need all of these protections anyway.
But that's the thing, though. You have to think Karen is probably a member of Solidarity or any trade union, people in formal employment, and that's the thing, right? In South Africa, we have to be like pretty much aware of our political context. If because this is something maybe it can be another paper, right? Let me not even dismiss it. Maybe in the future I can argue for something like that. I'm like the opponents of it when I'm, arguing not for the employment of the unemployed on a temporary basis too. If I were to say, let those currently employed right now, all the workers who are registered under the various trade union organizations all across the country, to lose all of these protections that were guaranteed to them. Like you would have legitimate political pushback. I think even more so because they're already organized groups, right? The unemployed, unfortunately, in South Africa are not organized. Yeah. But, labor is organized. Trade unions would not let that slide. Like you would be looking at even much more strenuous litigation because right now, right, the trade union does not have any self-interest in to look out for an unemployed person. An unemployed person does not pay dues, so why should they look out for them? They're looking out for their members. So I think that now my only really opponent would be, right, a politician who would be representing the unemployed. Instead of, if I'm arguing against all these regulations, I have not only the politician who would be representing the vulnerable, but also trade unions, right? And trade unions have a whole lot of financial muscle. I think it would be harder to pass a piece of law that would take away protections for people who are already employed than to say that, okay, you will be employed and the context would be no protections if so were. But yeah.
I think that answers, most of the questions that I have about the job seekers exemption, the JSEC, job seeker exemption certificate, and I think that it's almost what I kind of wrapped what I want to talk to you about. But the last thing I want to do is go back to kind of this general discussion in South Africa that we started in. And because I'm very interested in this, I think the listeners are quite well aware of your boss, David Ansara. And David has come on and he's argued against us and our love of the GNU. And said that we are, big government lovers, and that really we want a, giant, massive state to, rule the country. And unfortunately, David was the last time we spoke with him, we hadn't had this new budget out, and at the Common Sense here, we're a big fan of this budget, and we're a big fan of what it seems to represent. Because it seems that a lot on a macroeconomic level, that some fiscal discipline has really crept back in a meaningful way into the South African treasury. And so, what do you think about this whole GNU thing, and especially given in the context of this budget, if the GNU is able to pass pieces of legislation every now and again that are actually quite decent, is it worth it?
Is it worth it? Right?
Yeah.
This is very, because I'm sure when David gets to see it, he will see that I'm also being a GNU defender here, right? I am at the FMF, the residential GNU defender. I am not as opposed to them. I actually find the GNU to, I wouldn't say be good, but necessary. And I wouldn't say that they haven't done the best of jobs, but not the worst of jobs, right? So like I'm very much pro them. Concerning the budget, right? With Treasury, man, I have mixed feelings about Treasury. They disappointed me a great deal earlier on in the year, right, with the main budget beyond this midterm one, is that I hate anyone who raises taxes, but this is a very ideological part of me. And Treasury, for all its, insistence on fiscal discipline, and this is something that Treasury has been pretty consistent about, you could say, to varying degrees, really. Maybe you would say now we are nearing the cliff, so they're like, okay, pull the brakes. But when you argue for tax raises instead of government slashing and cutting government expenditure and making it seem like it is unfeasible to cut government expenditure, as Treasury was making it seem like when the main budget was being passed earlier on in the year, right? That I do not like. But I also have a very firm understanding that Treasury is probably the only aspect of the state that's like, maybe we can't just spend our way out of everything when everyone in the state is like, no, increase funding, just raise taxes, everything will be okay. Why is there no wealth tax, as some in the EFF would say, right?
Yeah.
So I'm very supportive of Treasury in that regard. I find the GNU, as I said, to be necessary. Right? I mentioned things like pit toilets earlier on, the fact that you have a minister who would not have run, the Department of Basic Education, and who was able to effect change to some degree, right, and things like that. That is good. The fact that you have, who is this, Leon Schreiber in the Department of Home Affairs,
Yes.
right? Like, that is cool. I have a lot of people interact with Home Affairs a lot, and they've been saying good things ever since he took over at Home Affairs, right? So I'm like, these things are not possible outside of the GNU, and I think if, things can always get worse, is what I always say. So like, I always appreciate things not getting worse. I will always choose, the better over the worse.
Yeah.
And I think the GNU is definitely the better, with all of its faults. With all of its faults, I would definitely say it's the better. The budget, though, I'm saying Treasury can do better. We need to fire more people. We need to scrap ministries. We need to take drastic measures, and I don't think Treasury is prepared to take drastic measures. The most drastic really was them refusing to grant the 7% wage increases to public employees, and I'm like, even still though, the compromise was a above inflation increase with like cash payouts to certain people. Like, no, we need to be better. So I'm thinking like Treasury, I want to hold their feet to the fire more, because they know the trouble we are in fiscally. Even though they are showing signs of saying we're trying to rein them in, they can do better. They can definitely do better.
Yeah, well, you wouldn't be a good libertarian if you didn't think that any spending of government money was a horrific waste of resources.
Of resources. But in South Africa, you don't even need to be a libertarian, right? You just have to just be reasonable and be like, come on, man. Like, you're telling me we needed a VAT increase to such, like, we can just save by eliminating, corruption, grift, and try something. I'm not even saying eliminate grift. I'm saying get rid of entire ministries. Get rid of them. Let them not exist anymore. Let them be absorbed by others. But have you seen a picture of our cabinet? It is huge, right? Our cabinet is huge. I have like 32 ministries with 37 deputy ministers. And this is just unfeasible. Yeah. Let us cut the jobs of those people. And I'm not even arguing. I'm like, let us cut social spending politically, which is be the hardest to do last. Let's cut that last. Let us, eliminate perks. You don't need a house in Cape Town and Pretoria, dear minister. Yeah. No, you don't. Let us eliminate all of these perks And I think we can definitely find ways to save money from the state instead of raising taxes. I'm opposed to government spending because government spending comes at the expense of raising taxes, right? If the state can have, a sovereign wealth fund, well, I guess the PIC was supposed to be that, unfortunately. But yeah, if the state can find a sovereign wealth fund that will sustain social spending without raising taxes, I doubt I'd even be opposed to that. But I don't want spending because spending necessitates taxes for us in South Africa. And even that, we are getting to a cliff, right? We can't raise tax. That's why they chose VAT, because income tax would not have created the result they would have wanted revenue-wise, because our tax base is shrinking. We've reached a point where an increase in income tax won't help us because we aren't growing. And now we are only left with, general taxes like VAT. By the way, I prefer a tax like VAT over a tax like a progressive income tax, but I don't want any tax to increase. And I feel like in South Africa, it is normalized. If we have, a budget shortfall, an expenditure shortfall, we raise tax. I'm like, no, let's cut expenditure. Everyone at home watching, if you spend more than you make, you can try and make more. That is great. But ideally, you want to also cut whatever it is that you are spending, right, in excess. And the idea of the state cutting what it is spending is unfathomable. They want to make more. You're like, okay, how do you make more? People have to be employed. They can't do that too. They can't make the trade-off of saying, if we're going to have high taxes, we need to have a very vibrant business environment, very dynamic labor market that will enable all of these people we are taxing to actually make money so that we can tax it. So we are kind of doing things that we aren't doing. We don't understand the trade-offs that we have to make. We have high taxes and a very bad business environment. I'm like, then you have the problems that we have in South Africa, right, where everything is just really, for lack of a better word, gone to expletive.
Well, I think that's a great place to end the discussions. Thank you so much for coming on, Zakes.
No, thank you for having me, It was a great chat.
I've been Gabriel Makin, and this has been Talking Sense.